Good evening. I am Lawrence Holgate, the author of Understanding John Locke, the Smart Student's Guide to Locke's Second Treatise of Government. I'll be reading out of the guide this evening, and we're in episode 12, Political or Civil Society. And in the concluding chapters or paragraphs of chapter 7 of Treatise, Second Treatise, Locke completes his explanation of the origin of political society, which he hinted at in chapter 3, where he remarked that the state of nature is always at great risk of devolving into a state of war. Locke argues that the only way to minimize this risk is to establish political society. And in the final paragraphs, he also shows why it is logically impossible for an absolute monarchy to qualify as a civil or political society. So we've got a lot to talk about. Let's begin with, in my book, at section 7.1, with the title, The Necessity to Establish Political Society. Locke was earlier quoted as having said that in a state of nature, men have, quote, perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. Paragraph 4. This freedom includes the power to punish the offenses of all those in the state of nature. But we know now that possession of the power to punish is exactly what can easily turn the state of nature into a state of war. The only way to avoid this is to create a civil society in which private judgments about who shall be punished, including the kind and the amount of their punishment, are excluded in favor of public judgments about these matters. Public judgments are those in which the community, and here I quote, comes to be umpire by settled standing rules indifferent and the same to all parties, and by men having authority from the community for the execution of these rules, decides all differences that may happen between any members of that society concerning any matter of rights, and punishes those offenses which any member has committed against the society with such penalties as the law has established. End quote. That's from paragraph 87. This marks the great distinction between the state of nature and civil society. To continue with Locke at paragraph 87, those who are united into one body and have a common established judicature to appeal to, with authority to decide controversies between them, are in civil society with one another. But those who have no such common appeal, I mean on earth, are still in the state of nature, each being where there is no other judge for himself and executioner, which is the perfect state of nature. Now, the power that is transferred from the state of nature to civil society is both legislative and executive. And by legislative power, I mean the power to make law and determine what punishment should be attached to the violations of laws. Executive power is the power not only to judge whether someone has or has not violated the law, it is also the power to determine, quote, how far offenses are to be punished when committed within the Commonwealth, end quote. And it is the power to determine, quote, how far injuries from without the Commonwealth are to be vindicated. By giving up the power to punish, each individual has given a right to the Commonwealth to employ his force for the execution of the judgments of the Commonwealth. Now, on a sidebar, I say that to restate a point made earlier, both the words civil society and state of nature are words that refer to a type of relationship between two or more individuals. Thus, to be in the state of nature is not to be walking around naked or living in the forest. It is to be in a relationship with others in which there is no one authorized to settle a dispute between them, if a dispute or disagreement should arise. By comparison, to be in civil society with others, that is, to be in that relationship, is to be in a relationship in which there is such an authoritative person or persons. So try to remember that. In a civil society, we have a relationship in which Someone is authoritative, an authoritative person, but in natural society, the state of nature, there is no such person, no authority to settle disputes. Moving on now to paragraph 7.2, to section 7.2 of chapter 7, from which I'm reading. It's called the social contract, and this is consequential for John Locke's theory. Imagine a small natural community of 100 members in which each person is in a state of nature relationship with another, each having the perfect freedom to do whatever they want to do without asking the permission of anyone. And let us also imagine that there are many members in the community who use their right to punish by accusing others of failing to conform to the law of nature. Not only do they threaten others with extreme kinds of punishment, including execution, but in many cases they carry out their threats by forcibly taking the accused person's possessions, kidnapping and jailing them, or in some cases, killing them. And in retaliation, the friends and family of the alleged offenders get revenge by doing the same thing to the punishers, as the punishers did to their friends and family members. Each member of the community is now acting as a judge, a jury, and an executioner, with the result that the state of nature has by now degraded into a violent state of war. The only remedy, according to Locke, is to create political society. And the only way to create political society is by a compact, or a contract, in which, quote, any number of men in the state of nature create a society that puts one people, one body politic under one supreme government, end quote. That's paragraph 89 of Second Treatise. When the people unanimously agree to do this, they immediately put themselves out of the state of nature, quote, into that of a commonwealth, by setting up a judge on earth with authority to determine all the controversies and redress the injuries that may happen to any member of the commonwealth. Paragraph 89. And if there are any persons in the state of nature who refuse to join them in this contract, then they remain in a state of nature relationship with all those who join and are now members of the new civil society. Sidebar, the idea of a social contract as the vehicle used to create civil society is not new with John Locke. Ancient philosophers also suggested a version of the contract theory. Plato, for example, in Republic, Book 2, used the character Glaucon to argue that people were so tired of suffering injustice at the hands of one another, even though they didn't mind doing injustice to them, that they came up to an agreement with each other neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. Let me repeat that. They came to an agreement with each other neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. Most of the people would keep to the agreement, mainly because they would not be able to do injustice without suffering a penalty. But the strongest among them would think that such an agreement would be insane. Why not reap the rewards of doing injustice if one was strong or clever enough to avoid the penalties? Using John Locke's language, the strongest would remain in a state of nature relationship with those who have agreed not to do injustice. So you have a state of nature in which the bully decides to remain, and you have a civil society in which people have contracted not to do injustice to one another. Section 7.3 of Chapter 7 has the title, The Inconsistency of Absolute Monarchy in Civil Society. Let us now imagine another community in which there is an absolute monarch with, quote, both legislative and executive power in himself alone. That's paragraph 91 of Second Treatise. This person creates and changes the law at will, determines who is and who is not guilty of violating the law, and also has absolute power to punish those he convicts. This is the community of the monarch. And in the monarch's community, quote, no appeal lies open to anyone who may fairly and indifferently and with authority decide, and from whose decision relief and redress may be expected of any injury and inconvenience. That is, there is no such person, so there's no person to appeal to. Now, if there is no such appeal to this indifferent and authoritative third party, Locke continues, then this monarch is in a state of nature relationship with each of its subjects. Think about it. If any one of the subjects is injured by the monarch and wants redress for his injury, then his only appeal is to the monarch. There's no third party who will decide a dispute between the accuser and the accused. Hence, it's logically impossible that the society so described could be a political or civil society. And here's how Locke puts it. For wherever any two men are who have no standing rule, no common judge to appeal to on earth for the determination of controversies of right between them, then they are still in the state of nature. I'm not sure whether I'm going to repeat the next. This is in the middle of page 93 of my book in chapter 7, section 7.3. I lay out the whole argument in premises and conclusion. I'll just read through it quickly. The argument is a classic example of modus tollens. Remember that? That's a kind of valid logic where you say if P then Q, but not Q, therefore not P. Let's begin with a hypothetical. If an absolute monarchy qualifies as a civil society, then there is a common judge to which anyone can appeal to settle disputes, including disputes between the monarch and his subject. And so what Locke does is to, in the next premise, is to deny the consequent of, in the second premise. That is, we've already read the if P then Q. Now we're going to read the not Q. In an absolute monarchy, there is no common judge to which a subject of the monarch can appeal in the event of a dispute between that member and the monarch. And he now draws a conclusion that negates the antecedent, the P in the if P then Q. He's going to negate it. Therefore, an absolute monarchy does not qualify as a civil society. That's it. There is not an absolute monarchy that qualifies as a civil society. Now, this type of argument is also called a reductio ad absurdum. Ad absurdum. That's Latin for reduction to absurdity, because the conclusion is absurd or unwanted by the proponents of absolute monarchy. Getting on now with this section of the chapter, in fact, Locke argues an absolute monarchy should be compared to the condition of slavery, not to the state of nature. He says, quote, in the ordinary state of nature, a man has the liberty of judging of his right and according to the best of his power to maintain it, end quote. But when he is accused, judged, and convicted of an offense by the absolute monarch, quote, he not only has no appeal, he is denied a liberty to judge or to defend his right. That's the condition of a slave, who is exposed to all the misery and inconveniences that a man can fear from a slave master who is corrupted with flattery and armed with power. John Locke, paragraph 91, second treatise. The victims of Locke's powerful argument against absolute monarchy includes his predecessors, Thomas Hobbes and Robert Filmer. Other victims would include Plato and his defense of the just city state ruled by the unelected philosopher kings, who retain all legislative and executive power unto themselves. Read Plato's Republic for that. So that's the end of this chapter 7. It gets us on, it shows why it is, and I think Locke has done this perfectly, why it is that the state of nature simply is not going to persist. We'll talk in the next episode about Chapter 8, the beginnings of political society. For those of you who have my book, go ahead and read that chapter, and I will talk about it and discuss it in episode 13. Thank you for listening.